Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture for English 2090. Today, we're going to talk about blaxploitation and really focusing on African American cinema during the 1970s, kind of introducing us to Petey Wheatstraw and so forth. So, let's start off with the exploitation genre itself. So, exploitation cinema thrived between the 1920s and the 1980s. And if you know anything about technology, 1980s, even though Beta was around a little bit in the late 70s, it's really the rise of VHS that kind of makes the exploitation genre irrelevant in theaters. So during this time, the exploitation genre explored content, content, obviously lurid content, but it really explored current trends, niche genres, and lurid content. The whole point was, again, independent cinema, right? The Hollywood system was really open to experimentation until the 1930s, and so then a lot of independent cinema was birthed because the Hollywood had specific codes, just like how we have rating system today. The Hollywood system had the Hays Code, which really was heavily enforced starting in the mid 30s, even though it existed beforehand. But basically, you could operate outside the studio system and explore taboo subject matters that Hollywood films shied away from. You could have nudity, right, and which Hollywood films were doing at this time, right? Especially with the drive-ins and all that, the 60s and 70s were just a huge time for American independent cinema. The grindhouse, where people could make really cheap movies, sell them at drive-through bundles, and make a lot of money. And so that's where the grindhouse, because they just grind them out. They were very they were trying to make movies very quickly and very cheaply. So some just really infamous, but also very kind of celebrated in kind of film circles are a couple of these. Unwed Mother, right? So 20,000 anguished girls wrote its blistering story, right, to really expose, now again, during the 30s, 40s, things that Hollywood wasn't talking about, right? Unwed mothers, teenage mothers, right? Things that, of course, today, MTV, has shows dedicated to. But, at the time, you didn't see it in Hollywood films, right? I Was a Shoplifter, like that. Just all these titles are hilarious because again, but it was this juvenile delinquency and crime and sensationalism that you didn't really see in a lot of specific Hollywood films. Reefer Madness, again, it was forbidden by a lot of Hollywood studios to show drug use. So what did, of course, the independent cinema do? Well, they showed a lot of drug use. Devil's Harvest, again, you could see the drug focus here. That leads us in the 70s why we have blaxploitation. So obviously, if you know anything about American cinema, and even today, even though it's a little bit more equalized, it's not 100% equal. Hollywood, especially in America, Hollywood did not really have a lot of roles for black people and black actors. Even when a black actor won an award, right, they weren't even allowed to go to the Oscars for a while. So, huge amounts of racism drove black artists to really start doing a lot of independent cinema. And there's a lot of good black independent cinema, even in the 30s. But the huge market started happening in the 70s. And of course, the rise of civil rights movement and all sorts of things, right, really occurred. So, blaxploitation, really, and it's just simultaneously. So it's very interesting. They weren't copying off of each other; it just kind of happened. Two films the same year. Generally, it just like months uh, between each other. Shaft, which was the Hollywood kind of version, and then Sweetback's Badass Song, which obviously X-rated, was the independent version. But again, they weren't copying each other. They weren't even trying to steal or plagiarize. It just was this weird coincidence. They wanted to do, they thought that because of the civil rights movement, Hollywood could exploit it. So they figured they could do kind of a more black oriented movie and make money. Independent cinema knew that, of course, with civil rights too, that they could really touch on a lot of political ideas going on at the time. And so it was just very interesting. And so both of these movies, really show. kind of difference between a Hollywood system and then the studio system, or excuse me, and then the kind of independent system. It's a very interesting kind of idea of why all of a sudden in the 70s, you saw a huge amount of black cinema, which was not the case right beforehand. So Blaxploitation tropes. Let's look at why it's going on, right? So Junius Griffin, head of the NAACP at the time, um, in LA, coined the term to attack the genre stereotypical tropes. So a lot of times there are urban blaxploitation films, which are typically set in poor neighborhoods, so of course reinforces that black people are poor and so forth. Rural blaxploitation films set in the South usually deal with modern slavery and of course segregation. What's important about this genre is that it is very political. It's focused on discrimination. It's focused on um, systematic enslavement, systematic discrimination. So it's a very tricky genre in a lot of ways because some people celebrate it and other people revile it. So blaxploitation includes several subtypes, and so it's just like any movie, there are crime, there's martial arts, there's westerns, there's horror, there's comedies, there's coming of age dramas, and so forth. Usually following the example set by Sweetback's Badass Song, many blaxploitation films feature funk and soul, jazz kind of soundtracks, heavy bass, funk beats, the wah wah guitars, so to speak. So there's a lot of kind of typical elements that you'll see, and no matter if it is a martial arts movie, if it's set in the South, there's going to be slavery. If it's set in the North, there's going to be some sort of poor or poverty idea where they have to fight corrupt white people. So, again, these are very stereotypical in a lot of depictions, but they were hugely popular and they made so much money. It's important to look at its influence. So when we look at the celebration and criticism, so here, right, some critics like Afani Shakur, William Lunn, as the Zine see the genre as black empowerment. So a lot of critics at the time, you are getting movies entirely made by African Americans. And that's a huge feat, right? And they're making millions of dollars. So you have actors, cinematographers, costume designers, all African American, right? So that's an important milestone for American cinema. But you have other people like Donald Bogle and Addison Gale who assert that it reinforces black and white stereotypes. So it's a very controversial, genre. Although most films depict sex and reinforce masculine stereotypes, another way that people celebrate blaxploitation, and one of the reasons why it was also popular at the time and even still studied today, is many films have very strong female leads. So not only do you see African American actors, you also see African American women in lead roles and behind the camera. So it's an important aspect, right? That you see strong female characters and strong female leads that, again, even were opposite of what a lot of white Hollywood cinema was producing at the time. They also feature a lot of gay characters, which, of course, you don't really see in Hollywood movies during the 70s and so forth. And if you see them, they're typically bad people. Um, in this case, they're usually played as victims. Now, they're often the comic relief, so they are depicted as foolish, which, of course, then, goes back to, of course, what, a lot of people don't like about the blaxploitation genre is that the characters are stereotypical. But unlike a lot of other films, the gay characters were typically good guys. So even today, they're oftentimes, when you have an effeminate man, he's usually a bad guy in film. A lot of these films, they were the sidekicks, they were the friends, or they were victims themselves. So it really had a commentary on how minorities are exploited and discriminated against and so forth. So it's very, again, it's a very hard genre to look at times academically because it is problematic. But it's hugely influential, so we kind of need to study, and again, just to give you an example of all the different kind of female-led ones we have Foxy Brown, Velvet Smooth, Sugar Hill, Cleopatra Jones, T&T Jackson, Coffee, Black Mama, White Mama, so a lot of very, and again, you can see the objectification. You can see where a lot of people are like, I don't know about, but they are very powerful women, and they're very powerful female characters. So, very different, right, from what Hollywood was used to. And of course, Black Shampoo being a very popular comedy action movie. Again, you could see the typical, masculine hero and so forth defending the women, but very different than Hollywood. You have a lot of interracial couples, you have a lot of interracial sex, and that, of course, was hugely controversial, but also hugely provocative and interesting to a lot of people. So, again, it's a very interesting idea. Black Samurai, again, to show you the different genres, Jim Kelly, because Bruce Lee helped him become a little famous. Jim Kelly was able to again branch off and be his own star in his own movies, and so the blaxploitation genre really helped you know other black actors, entertainers who normally wouldn't have their chance to become famous, right, and household names. Again, comedies and so forth, Adios Amigos, again, Western comedy. You have Joshua, you have Westerns. And then we get into the vile, like, oh, okay, this is why it failed. So blaxploitation went too far for a lot of people, right? And that's when it kind of gets a little bad, right? So also horror, and again, Black Hyde, Mr. Hyde, or sorry, Dr. Black and Mr. Hyde. We have Black Frankenstein. We have Blackula. So you can see that it runs a gamut of serious to very silly to very racist, right? So, and of course, a very prominent genre, of course, was the kind of pimp genre, and the Mac was really the first film to really depict pimps in just any kind of setting, and of course, Superfly and a lot of others followed suit. So obviously, with that one, you can see where it's again very problematic. So the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then the National Urban League joined to form a coalition against blaxploitation in '72. So even though it lasts a good decade, early on the opposition was there, and they saw that no, this could get out of hand, and it did get out of hand. So they succeeded with influencing the public in Hollywood in 1975, and this is why. And so, blaxploitation, even though it's still independent, African American artists are making films in the blaxploitation genre till about the 80s. Um, it Mandingo is where it really gets bad because this was produced by white people. It was produced by Italian and American movie makers, and it's just awful. It's terrible. So this is the problem. So like it was again written, directed, and produced by white men. So you didn't have any of the diversity behind the camera, anything. And so it was seen as promoting slavery as sexy, and it just you could even see by the cover. It's, yeah, it's not a good movie. Because of this film, a lot of restrictions then were put into place, and so the genre really began falling out of favor almost immediately in '75. But there was still a good amount of smart African American independent filmmakers who were making legitimate movies that they weren't, trying to exploit, but it just fell under this category because again, racism. So they're black, so they're doing blaxploitation. So they had issues and had restrictions, but they were still making movies at least in an independent way. But it really fell out of favor because of this film really started the backlash. And after '75, there's a few ones that really do very well because as we'll see with Rudy Ray Moore, the movie that he produces and makes in '75 is one of the highest grossing films. So it's just a very complicated 10 years of cinema when we look at blaxploitation because there's so much going on. So when we get to Rudy Ray Moore, right? So he was a comedian and filmmaker, using his most popular persona as the main character. So, again, talk about a very controversial figure himself. His comedy albums are very, 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 very lurid, right? Oh, man, I'm spilling everything here. So his kind of franchise starts with Dolemite, and that was his character. So based on his stand-up act, his first movie grossed $12 million in the same year that Mandingo, and Mandingo made very little money. So it's the same year, and so this is why blaxploitation is really hard to pinpoint in terms of like specific. Oh no, this is when it falls off. This is when it rises, because it's a constant kind of debate in the larger societies, with minorities really loving blaxploitation, white people having a problem with it, other minorities not liking it. And so it's a very interesting kind of battleground when you look at cinema. Now, his, again, independently produced, there's a good movie that was made on Netflix about it with Eddie Murphy, but so if you want to look at it, it's very interesting in terms of how he made the film, but he made it on his own, right? He made it with his friends, and totally outside the studio system. And it became the 23rd highest grossing movie of that year. Again, very popular. And it was comedic minded. It was very different than what a lot of the other previous kind of blaxploitation films were doing. It has the complete spirit of independence, right? A lot of critics, I can't remember the one from New York Times, but said like this is the Citizen Kane of blaxploitation, right? Because it was a very celebrated film. People loved it. People flocked to it. It was fun for a lot of people. So um, it is an important film. What we're going to look at is his adaptation, right? So Petey Wheatstraw, right? So he takes elements from Faust, right? He takes elements from The Exorcist and a lot of other movies, right? And he's making fun of blaxploitation at the same time as using it as a genre and so forth. So it was a popular movie and remains actually one of his most celebrated. Even Dolemite was the most popular at the time, and again made the most money. Um, this one actually kind of has become everybody's favorite. Again, it's very independent, so I'll be curious to see what you think. It's a really celebrated adaptation of Faustus, and it's a very celebrated kind of work for American independent cinema. So again, we'll work through a lot of these kind of concepts this week, especially because again, Peter Wheatstraw has a lot of problematic scenes and so forth. So it has an enormous influence, right? Especially on modern hip hop culture and movies. There's so much, and because of blaxploitation, when you have 10 years of nonstop movies that show African American artists, that's not just going to go away. All of a sudden, Hollywood now has to, oh, okay, we have to employ people. We have to think about, catering to different audiences and so forth. So blaxploitation forced Hollywood to become more diverse, right? Even though it's still not equal, but to become more diverse, right? And so it's influential. There's so many movies and directors that really take and pay homage and really take a lot of important aspects from it. Almost every rapper in some form or another references blaxploitation. Wu Tang, 50 Cent, Snoop Dogg, Public Enemy. There's so many, and even Rudy Ray Moore did guest vocals on many different rap songs in the '90s and early 2000s. So, there's so much important kind of influence there. So, it's an important genre because it really established African American artistic forces. But of course, it's a problematic genre since it does have a lot of stereotypes and things. So I'll be curious to see what you think about it, because when you study film, it's a very kind of fun genre to explore because you see things that you don't typically see in movies at this time. But it's also, especially compared with nowadays, there's a lot of problems to it. With depictions of women and depictions of black people, white people, gay people, everything. So we want to look at this kind of intellectually and see how we feel about the genre. Obviously, as always, if you have questions, post Canvas forum, email. If not, just best of luck this week and take care.